45-year-old Caroline hasn't spoken to her sister Rebecca in 23 years, not since the devastating argument that tore their family apart, but when their elderly aunt passes away and leaves behind a sealed letter addressed to both sisters, Caroline is forced to confront the past she's been running from. The words written decades ago by someone who witnessed everything will reveal a truth so shocking it will shatter the story Caroline has been telling herself for half her lifetime. The lawyer's office smelled like old books and furniture polish, the kind of smell that made Caroline think of institutions and formality and things that couldn't be undone. She sat in a leather chair across from Martin Fletcher, her late Aunt Dorothy's attorney, trying not to fidget with the wedding ring she still wore even though her divorce had been finalized 2 years ago. 45 years old, and she was still holding on to symbols of relationships that had ended badly. Maybe that was her pattern. Maybe she'd always been better at clinging to the past than building a future. As I mentioned on the phone, Martin was saying, his voice carrying that practiced gentleness lawyers used when discussing death and money, your aunt left very specific instructions about her estate. Most of it is straightforward. The house goes to charity, savings split between various organizations she supported, but there's one item she insisted be handled personally. He pulled a cream-colored envelope from a folder on his desk. This letter, it's addressed to both you and your sister Rebecca. Mrs. Whitmore was quite insistent that you both be present when it's opened. Caroline felt her stomach clench at the mention of Rebecca's name. 23 years. 23 years since she'd seen her sister, since they'd spoken, since they'd been in the same room together. The longest estrangement of Caroline's life. Longer than her marriage had lasted. Longer than she'd lived in any one place. Longer than any friendship or job or commitment she'd managed to maintain. Rebecca was the ghost that haunted every family gathering Caroline attended, or rather didn't attend, because how could you go to Thanksgiving or Christmas or weddings when your own sister wouldn't be in the same room as you? I'm not sure Rebecca will come, Caroline said carefully. We haven't been in contact. Martin's expression suggested he already knew this. Mrs. Whitmore was aware. In fact, she made arrangements. Ms. Rebecca Moore has already been contacted and has agreed to be here. She should arrive any moment. Caroline's hands tightened on the arms of the chair. She had a habit of holding her breath when she was anxious, counting to 10 before releasing it slowly, a technique some therapist had taught her years ago that had never quite worked the way it was supposed to. She was doing it now, lungs burning, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, while her mind raced with the impossibility of what was about to happen. Rebecca was coming here, would be in this room. After 23 years of silence and separate lives, and a chasm so wide Caroline had stopped believing it could ever be crossed. She stood up abruptly. I can't do this. I'm sorry, but I can't. The door to the office opened, and there she was. Rebecca looked older, of course. She'd be 42 now, 3 years younger than Caroline, though the years had been kinder to her. Or maybe Rebecca had just taken better care of herself. Her dark hair was shorter than Caroline remembered, cut in a sleek bob that framed a face that was both familiar and strange. She wore a navy blazer and jeans, professional but casual, the kind of outfit that suggested she'd driven straight from work and hadn't agonized over what to wear to see the sister she hadn't spoken to since she was 19 years old. Their eyes met. Caroline saw shock register on Rebecca's face, probably mirroring her own expression, followed by something harder to read. Not anger exactly, not the raw fury that had characterized their last encounter, something more like grief or resignation, or maybe just exhaustion at the weight of carrying 23 years of unfinished business. Caroline, Rebecca said, her voice neutral, neither warm nor cold, just stating a fact. Caroline exists. Caroline is here. Rebecca? Caroline's voice came out rougher than she intended. She cleared her throat. I didn't know you'd actually come. Aunt Dorothy asked. Rebecca moved into the room but kept the maximum possible distance between them, taking the chair on the opposite side of Martin's desk. I couldn't say no to her, even posthumously. Martin cleared his throat diplomatically. Thank you both for coming. I know this isn't easy. Mrs. Whitmore was very specific that this letter needed to be read by both of you, together. She said, and I'm quoting here, they need to hear this at the same time, from me, or they'll never hear it at all. Caroline felt tears prick at her eyes. That sounded like Aunt Dorothy, meddling even from beyond the grave, refusing to let sleeping dogs lie, convinced that every problem had a solution if people would just sit down and talk about it. But some problems didn't have solutions. Some wounds were too deep, some words too devastating to take back. Caroline had learned that 23 years ago on a cold November night, when she'd said unforgivable things to her sister, and Rebecca had said unforgivable things back, and their parents had stood between them, looking helpless and heartbroken. "Can we just—" Caroline gestured at the envelope. "Can we just get this over with?" Martin looked at Rebecca, who nodded. He carefully broke the seal, red wax, pressed with Aunt Dorothy's initial, and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in their aunt's distinctive handwriting. Large, looping letters written with a fountain pen, the kind of penmanship from another era when people still wrote letters by hand and took pride in their script. "Dear Caroline and Rebecca," Martin began reading aloud, "if you're hearing this, I'm dead, which means I no longer have to worry about you both hating me for what I'm about to tell you. I should have told you decades ago. I should have stopped what happened. But I was a coward, and I convinced myself that staying silent was kinder than speaking up. I was wrong, and I've carried the weight of that wrong for 23 years, watching you both live separate lives, watching your parents grieve the loss of their daughter's relationship, watching two sisters who loved each other more than anything in the world become strangers because of a lie I helped perpetuate." Caroline's breath caught. A lie. Aunt Dorothy was talking about a lie. She looked at Rebecca and saw her sister's face had gone pale, her hands gripping the arms of her chair the same way Caroline's were gripping hers. Whatever was in this letter, Rebecca didn't know about it either. They were both about to learn something that would change everything. Martin continued reading. "I need to start at the beginning, not the beginning you both know, but the real beginning. The night of your parents' 30th anniversary party, November 15th, 2001. Do you remember that night? Of course you do. It's the night everything fell apart, the night you stopped being sisters. But what you don't know, what neither of you has ever known, is what really happened that night, what really caused the argument that destroyed your relationship. And I'm the only person left alive who knows the truth, so it falls to me to finally tell it." Caroline's mind was reeling. November 15th, 2001. She remembered that night like it was yesterday. She'd been 22 years old, home from college for the weekend. Rebecca had been 19, still living at home, working at a bookstore while figuring out what she wanted to do with her life. Their parents, Thomas and Linda Moore, had been married for 30 years, and they'd thrown a big party to celebrate. Friends, family, neighbors, everyone gathered at their childhood home in suburban Philadelphia. And that was the night David had arrived. David Chen, Rebecca's boyfriend. Or Caroline's boyfriend. That had been the question, hadn't it? That had been the argument that had started everything. Because Caroline had been dating David first. They'd met at college, dated for 6 months, broken up in August. And then somehow, impossibly, David had started dating Rebecca, had shown up at the anniversary party as Rebecca's date, had walked in holding her sister's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world, like he hadn't spent the previous 6 months sleeping in Caroline's bed, meeting her friends, talking about their future together. Caroline had confronted Rebecca, had pulled her aside in their parents' kitchen and demanded to know what the hell she was doing, dating her sister's ex-boyfriend, bringing him to a family event like it wasn't a betrayal of everything sisters were supposed to be to each other. And Rebecca had said, God, Caroline could still hear the words in her head, could still feel the way they'd landed like physical blows. "He was never really yours, Caroline. He told me. He said you were never serious, that it was just casual, that you knew it wasn't going anywhere." And Caroline had called her sister a liar, had called her worse than a liar, had said that Rebecca had always been jealous of her, had always wanted what Caroline had, and now she was stealing Caroline's boyfriend because that's what jealous little sisters did. And Rebecca had fired back that Caroline was delusional, that she made everything about herself, that maybe if Caroline hadn't been so self-absorbed, she would have noticed that David had never been that into her in the first place. It had escalated from there. Their parents had tried to intervene, but the damage was done. Caroline had left the party, had cut off contact with Rebecca completely, had told their parents she would never speak to her sister again, and she'd meant it. And for 23 years, she'd kept that promise. But now Aunt Dorothy was saying there'd been a lie, something they didn't know, something that would explain what? How did you explain away that kind of betrayal? How did you rewrite history to make it hurt less? Martin's voice pulled Caroline back to the present. "The truth is this. David Chen wasn't dating either of you that night. He was using both of you, and I knew because I saw him. The week before the party, I was in Philadelphia for a medical appointment. I had lunch at that cafe near your parents' house. You know the one. The Italian place with the red awning. And I saw David there with another woman. Not you, Caroline, not you, Rebecca. A third woman. They were very clearly together, holding hands, kissing, the whole 9 yards. And when I got closer, I heard him call her his fiancée. Caroline felt the room spin. She looked at Rebecca and saw her sister's mouth hanging open, eyes wide with shock. Neither of them had known. All these years, and neither of them had known. I confronted him in the parking lot after. Asked him what the hell he was doing, given that I knew he was dating my niece, and he had the audacity to lie to my face. Said it wasn't what it looked like, that the other woman was his ex, that it was complicated. But I could see right through him. He was playing you both. Probably had been all along. The fiancé was probably the real relationship, and you two were just side entertainments, ways to boost his ego, games he was playing. Caroline's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs, trying to ground herself. 23 years. 23 years of hating her sister, of believing Rebecca had betrayed her, of carrying that anger like a stone in her chest. And it had all been based on a lie. Not Rebecca's lie, David's lie. He'd played them against each other and they'd fallen for it. I should have told you both immediately. Should have called Caroline, called Rebecca, told your parents, but I talked myself out of it. I told myself it would be too embarrassing for you both, too humiliating to admit you'd been fooled by the same man. I told myself that maybe I was wrong, that maybe there was an explanation. And then the party happened, and you two had that terrible fight, and I realized, my God, he'd actually brought Rebecca to the party. He'd deliberately caused this. He'd wanted you two to fight over him, and I still said nothing. Martin paused, and Caroline could see he was uncomfortable reading this, that he understood the magnitude of what he was revealing. I watched you both destroy your relationship over a man who wasn't worth either of you. I watched your parents' hearts break. I watched Thanksgivings and Christmases get divided up. Caroline at the early dinner, Rebecca at the late one, never the two of you together. I watched weddings where one of you was invited and the other wasn't. I watched births and deaths and all the moments that should have brought you together push you further apart. And I said nothing because I was ashamed. Because the longer I stayed silent, the harder it became to speak up. Because I was a coward. The lawyer set down the first page and picked up the second. His voice was gentler now, as if he understood these next words would hurt even more than the ones that came before. Caroline, Rebecca, I know this doesn't undo 23 years of pain. I know sorry isn't enough, but I need you both to understand something. The fight you had that night wasn't about David. Not really. It was about the fear that you'd lost each other to something stronger than your sisterhood, that a man could come between you. That blood wasn't thicker than romance. But here's the truth, there was no romance, there was just a manipulative boy playing games with two incredible women. And you both fell for it because you were young and he was convincing, and neither of you had any reason to suspect he'd be that cruel. Caroline felt tears streaming down her face. She didn't try to stop them. Across the desk, Rebecca was crying too, silently, her shoulders shaking with the effort of keeping the sobs contained. 23 years of anger, 23 years of estrangement, 23 years of missing each other, all of it based on a lie that Aunt Dorothy could have exposed with a single phone call. I'm telling you this now because I won't be around much longer. The cancer is advancing quickly and I know I won't see another Christmas, and I can't go to my grave carrying this secret. You both deserve the truth. You deserve to know that the argument that destroyed your relationship was manufactured by someone who wanted to hurt you both. And you deserve the chance to decide, now that you know the truth, whether those 23 years have to define the rest of your lives. If this story has touched your heart so far, please leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me in the comments if you've ever lost a relationship over a misunderstanding. These stories matter because they remind us that it's never too late to seek the truth. Martin set down the second page and looked at both women with an expression of profound sympathy. There's more, he said gently. Are you both all right to continue? Caroline nodded, not trusting her voice. Rebecca did the same. They still hadn't looked directly at each other since Martin had started reading, as if the weight of the revelation was too heavy to carry while making eye contact. Martin picked up the third page. I need to tell you about David Chen. about what happened to him after that night, because you both deserve to know the rest of the story. After the party, after he succeeded in turning you against each other, he disappeared from both your lives. Neither of you reached out to him as far as I know. Caroline, you were too angry at Rebecca to even think about him. Rebecca, you were too devastated by your sister's accusations to continue whatever you thought you had with him. He just vanished, and I was relieved. I thought maybe the damage would be contained to just that one night. I thought maybe you'd both eventually forgive each other and move on. Caroline remembered those weeks after the party. She'd been so consumed with rage at Rebecca that David had become almost irrelevant. He'd been the catalyst, but Rebecca had been the traitor. That's how Caroline had framed it in her mind. Her sister, the person who was supposed to have her back no matter what, had chosen a boy over their relationship. That betrayal had felt worse than anything David had done. But then I found out the truth, the whole truth. I hired a private investigator. Yes, I know how that sounds, but I needed to know who this man really was, what I was dealing with, and what I found out made me physically ill. Aunt Dorothy's handwriting got shakier here, as if writing these next words had cost her something. David Chen was running a scheme, not just with you two, but with multiple women. He was what they call a romance scammer. He'd date several women at once, usually ones who didn't know each other or move in the same circles. He'd borrow money from them, small amounts at first, then larger sums. He'd create sob stories about family emergencies or business opportunities, and then he'd disappear, moving on to the next city, the next batch of victims. Caroline felt her stomach drop. She remembered now. David had borrowed money from her. $300 for what he'd said was a car repair. She'd never gotten it back, but she'd been so focused on the breakup and then the fight with Rebecca that she'd forgotten about it entirely. $300 had seemed like such a small thing compared to losing her sister. The investigator found 7 other women who'd been involved with David in the previous 2 years. 7. He had a pattern. He'd target women in their early 20s, usually in college towns or cities with transient populations where people came and went frequently. He'd date them just long enough to gain their trust, borrow money, and move on. With you two, he'd tried something different. He'd tried to see if he could date sisters simultaneously. I think he got off on the power of it. The manipulation, the chaos he could create. Martin paused to take a sip of water. His own hands were shaking slightly. The investigator also found the fiancée I'd seen. Her name was Lisa Chang. She had no idea about any of the other women. She thought David was faithful, thought they were building a life together. When the investigator approached her with evidence of what David had been doing, she was devastated. She broke off the engagement immediately. And David? Well, David moved to Los Angeles, reinvented himself, started the whole scheme over again with a new name, new story, new victims. Caroline closed her eyes. All these years, she'd thought of David as just a bad boyfriend, an ex she'd wasted 6 months on. But he'd been so much worse than that. He'd been a predator, and she and Rebecca had been his victims, but instead of recognizing that and supporting each other, they'd turned on each other. They'd done exactly what he'd wanted them to do. Here's the part that haunts me most, the letter continued. I could have stopped him. I knew what he was. I had evidence. I could have gone to the police, could have warned other women, could have done something to prevent him from hurting more people. But I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my business, that you two were adults who'd made your own choices, that getting involved would just make everything messier. And so I stayed silent. And David went on to hurt other women. I don't know how many. The investigator lost track of him after Los Angeles, but I know there were more. And I carry that weight too. Rebecca finally spoke, her voice raw. Where is he now? David, do we know? Martin looked at his notes. Mrs. Whitmore's letter doesn't say. She wrote this 6 months ago, before she got too sick to write. But she did leave a file. He pulled a thick manila folder from his desk drawer. Everything the private investigator found, names, dates, police reports from some of the victims who did file charges. He was arrested twice, once in San Diego in 2006, once in Denver in 2012. Served short sentences both times. After that, the trail goes cold. Caroline felt something break open in her chest. David had gone on to hurt more women, had been arrested, had served time, and she'd had no idea. She'd been so wrapped up in her anger at Rebecca, so convinced that her sister was the villain of the story, that she'd never once thought to look deeper into what David had been, who he really was. what he was capable of. I'm telling you all this, Aunt Dorothy's letter continued, not to make excuses for my silence or to shift blame onto David, though God knows he deserves all the blame in the world. I'm telling you because I want you both to understand the full scope of what happened that night. You didn't just have a fight over a boy. You were manipulated by someone who understood exactly how to exploit the insecurities between sisters. The competition that sometimes exists even in the most loving relationships, the fear that you're not enough, that your sister is better, that love is a finite resource that can be stolen away. Caroline thought about her relationship with Rebecca before David. They'd been close, not just sisters but best friends. Rebecca had been the first person Caroline called when anything good or bad happened. They'd shared clothes and secrets and dreams. They'd planned to grow old together, to be aunts to each other's children, to sit on a porch somewhere in their 80s and laugh about all the stupid things they'd done when they were young. And then one night, one argument, and all of it was gone. 23 years of silence, 23 years of holidays spent separately, 23 years of their parents trying to mediate between them and failing. Their father had died 5 years ago, and Caroline and Rebecca had attended separate funeral services rather than be in the same room together. That's how deep the estrangement had gone. They'd chosen to grieve their father in shifts rather than face each other. I know I can't undo the damage. I know 23 years is a long time and maybe too much has been broken to fix, but I'm asking you both, begging you both, to at least try, to sit down together, just the two of you, and talk. Really talk. Not about David or what he did or whose fault anything was. Talk about what you've lost. Talk about whether you want to lose more. Talk about whether the next 23 years are going to look like the last 23, or whether you're brave enough to write a different story. Martin set down the third page and pulled out a fourth. There's one more section, he said quietly. Mrs. Whitmore asked me to read it only if you were both still here. Some people leave at this point. The information is too overwhelming, but you've both stayed, and that matters. Caroline looked at Rebecca for the first time since the reading had begun, really looked at her. Her sister's face was blotchy from crying, mascara smudged under her eyes. She looked exhausted, but she also looked, Caroline searched for the right word, open. Like something that had been locked tight for decades had finally cracked open just enough to let light in. Caroline and Rebecca, Martin continued reading, if you're still both sitting in Martin's office, if you haven't walked out, then there's one more thing I need to tell you. Something I should have said years ago but didn't, because I was respecting your parents' wishes. Your father knew about David, about the scam, about all of it. I told him everything the private investigator found. This was about 10 years ago, right after your mother died. He begged me to tell you both, to finally reveal the truth, but he also understood why I hadn't. He knew that at a certain point, the silence becomes its own kind of truth, that saying nothing for so long makes it almost impossible to speak up. Caroline felt her world tilt. Her father had known. For the last 10 years of his life, her father had carried this truth, and he'd never said anything. She'd spent those 10 years carefully timing her visits home so she wouldn't overlap with Rebecca. Their father had gone along with it, had never pushed them to reconcile, had accepted the separate holidays and the divided grief, and all along he'd known it was based on a lie. Your father made me promise something before he died. He made me promise that if I outlived him, which we both knew was likely given his heart condition, I would tell you both the truth, no matter how long it took, no matter how angry you might be at me for staying silent. He said, Dorothy, my girls need to know. They need to know so they can choose to be sisters again, or at least choose with all the information. Right now they're making choices based on false premises, and that's the cruelest thing of all. Rebecca made a sound, something between a sob and a laugh. Caroline understood. The idea that their father had known, had wanted them to reconcile, had died hoping they'd find their way back to each other, it was almost too much to bear. So, here's what I'm asking. Not for my sake, I'll be dead when you hear this, and not even for your father's sake, though God knows he wanted it. I'm asking for your sake, both of you. I've watched you build separate lives. Caroline, you got married, had 2 beautiful children, got divorced. Rebecca, you started that non-profit, bought a house, built a community of friends who love you. You've both done remarkable things with your lives. But I know, because your father told me, and because I've seen it with my own eyes, that there's a hole in both your lives shaped like the sister you lost. Caroline thought about her children. Emma, who was now 18 and away at college, and Lucas, who was 15 and living with his father most of the time. She told them about their Aunt Rebecca in the vaguest possible terms. "We had a falling out when I was young. We don't talk anymore." Emma had pressed for details, but Caroline had shut down the conversation. How could you explain to your children that you'd thrown away your relationship with your sister over a boy whose name you now barely remembered? Except she did remember his name, David Chen. She'd remembered it every day for 23 years, even when she'd tried to forget. And now she knew why forgetting had been impossible, because the wound had never healed. It had just festered, hidden beneath scar tissue that looked like strength but was really just numbness. "Here's my final gift to you both," the letter concluded. "I've left you the lake house. Joint ownership. You'll have to decide together what to do with it. Sell it, keep it, rent it out. But the decision has to be mutual. You'll have to communicate. You'll have to sit down together and talk about what you both want. And maybe, while you're talking about the lake house, you'll also talk about everything else, or maybe you won't. Maybe you'll hire lawyers to negotiate and you'll sell it sight unseen and go back to your separate lives. That's your choice. But at least you'll make that choice knowing the truth, knowing that what broke you apart was a lie, and what keeps you apart is only your own fear and pride." Martin set down the last page and looked at both women. "That's the end of the letter. But there's one more thing. Mrs. Whitmore left video messages, one for each of you. Private messages she recorded in her final weeks. You can watch them here, or I can send them to you, or you can choose not to watch them at all. Whatever you decide, I have one more task, the keys to the lake house." He pulled 2 identical keys from an envelope and set them on the desk between Caroline and Rebecca. "These are yours, both of yours. What you do with them is up to you." Silence filled the office. Caroline stared at the key closer to her, its brass surface catching the light from the window. The lake house. She remembered it from childhood, the summers she and Rebecca had spent there with Aunt Dorothy, swimming in the lake, catching fireflies, staying up late telling stories. Before David, before everything fell apart, when being sisters had been the easiest, most natural thing in the world. She reached out slowly and picked up her key. Across the desk, Rebecca did the same. Their eyes met, and for the first time in 23 years they really saw each other. Not through the lens of anger or betrayal or accumulated resentment, just 2 women who'd loved each other once and had let a lie destroy what they'd built. "I want to watch my video," Rebecca said, her voice hoarse. "But not here, not now. I need time to process this." Caroline nodded. "Me too." She paused, the next words feeling impossible but necessary. "Do you want to, should we maybe—" "Coffee," Rebecca said quickly. "There's a cafe across the street. We could, if you want to, we could get coffee. Talk. Not about anything heavy, just talk." Caroline felt tears well up again. Coffee. Such a simple thing. The thing sisters did. The thing they used to do all the time before their world imploded. "Yes, I'd like that." They stood up simultaneously, thanked Martin, and walked out of the office into the bright autumn afternoon. The cafe was indeed across the street, a small place with outdoor seating, and the smell of espresso drifting through the open door. They got their drinks. Caroline ordered a cappuccino, Rebecca got an Americano, and sat at a table far from other customers, creating a bubble of privacy in the public space. For a long moment neither of them spoke. They just sat there, holding their coffee cups, letting the reality of what they'd learned settle over them like snow. Finally, Rebecca spoke. "I thought you hated me." "I did," Caroline said honestly. "For 23 years I hated you, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry I never questioned it, never looked deeper, never gave you the benefit of the doubt." "I hated you too," Rebecca admitted. "I hated you for calling me a liar, for believing I could do that to you, for thinking I was the kind of person who'd steal my sister's boyfriend. You weren't. You aren't." Caroline's voice broke. "And I should have known that. Should have known you better than I knew him. But I didn't, and I'm sorry." They talked for 2 hours in that cafe, the coffee growing cold as they unpacked 23 years of silence. Caroline told Rebecca about her marriage, how she'd married someone safe and boring because she was terrified of being fooled again, and how that safety had eventually felt like suffocation. How her ex-husband was a good man, but they'd had nothing in common except fear of being alone. How the divorce had been sad, but also a relief, like finally admitting a truth everyone had known but been too polite to say. Rebecca told Caroline about her non-profit, a women's shelter she'd started 12 years ago. I think I've been trying to help women avoid what happened to us, Rebecca said. Women who get manipulated by men who are good at lying. I never connected it consciously, but maybe that's what it's always been about. Saving other women because I couldn't save us. You have children? Caroline asked, realizing she knew almost nothing about her sister's life. No, I never. After everything with David, I didn't trust my judgment about men. I dated a few people over the years, but I could never commit. Always waiting for the other shoe to drop, you know? Always assuming they were lying even when they weren't. Rebecca smiled sadly. I think I've been punishing every man I've met for what one man did when I was 19. Caroline nodded. I know exactly what you mean. I told my daughter recently that she should never trust people too quickly. She asked me why I was so cynical, and I didn't have a good answer. Or rather, I had an answer, David, but I couldn't explain it without explaining everything else, without explaining you. Tell me about your kids, Rebecca said. Please, I've missed so much. So Caroline pulled out her phone and showed Rebecca pictures. Emma at her high school graduation, Lucas at his basketball games, both of them as babies and toddlers and awkward pre-teens, and Rebecca cried looking at the photos, mourning the aunt she'd never gotten to be, the birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments she'd missed. They don't even know me, Rebecca said. Your kids don't know they have an aunt. What did you tell them? The truth, sort of, that we had a falling out and didn't speak anymore. Emma asked if I missed you. I told her no, which was a lie. Lucas never asked. He's not much of a talker. Do you? Rebecca looked up from the phone, her eyes searching Caroline's face. Miss me, I mean. Did you miss me? Caroline felt something break open in her chest. Every single day, every holiday, every milestone, every moment I wanted to call someone who would understand, because we grew up in the same house, had the same parents, knew the same stories. I missed you so much, it became like background noise. Always there, so constant I stopped consciously noticing it. But yes, God, yes, I missed you. Rebecca reached across the table and took Caroline's hand. It was the first time they'd touched in 23 years. Caroline felt the contact like an electric shock, familiar and foreign at the same time. Her sister's hand. The hand that used to hold hers when they crossed streets as children, that used to braid her hair, that used to exist in her life as a constant, unremarkable presence. I'm sorry, Rebecca whispered. I'm sorry I believed him when he said you weren't serious. I'm sorry I didn't come to you first, didn't ask you what happened between you two. I'm sorry I let him walk into that party with me like it was normal. I was young and stupid and I thought I was in love, but that's no excuse. I betrayed you even if I didn't mean to. You didn't betray me, Caroline said firmly. He betrayed both of us. He set us up to hurt each other, and we fell for it. We spent 23 years playing out the exact script he wrote for us. That's what I can't forgive. Not what you did, but what I did. I chose to believe the worst of you. I chose to end our relationship over a man I'd known for 6 months, instead of fighting for the sister I'd known my whole life. They sat there holding hands across the coffee shop table, two middle-aged women crying in public, and neither of them cared who saw. The lost years hung between them like a weight, but so did the possibility of found years ahead, of time they could still have if they were brave enough to try. Aunt Dorothy was right, Rebecca said finally, about the lake house. We need to go there, together, see it, decide what to do with it, but really, we need to just be in the same space without lawyers or letters or anyone else's words between us. When? Caroline asked. I can take time off work. I'm freelance now, so my schedule is flexible. Next weekend, I can drive up from Baltimore. Where are you living now? Boston. I can drive down. Meet you there? Rebecca nodded. The lake house. Next Saturday. 10 a.m.? She paused. And Caroline? Thank you. For staying. For not walking out. For being willing to hear the truth even when it was awful. Thank you for the same. They exchanged phone numbers, actual phone numbers, typed into each other's phones right there at the table like it was the most normal thing in the world, instead of a miracle. Then they stood up, and Rebecca pulled Caroline into a hug. A real hug. Not the awkward side squeeze of acquaintances, but the full-body embrace of people who'd known each other their entire lives. Caroline buried her face in her sister's shoulder and let herself cry properly, all the grief and loss and relief pouring out of her in waves. When they finally pulled apart, Rebecca said, I need to tell you something else. Something I found out about 6 months ago, right before Aunt Dorothy got really sick. I hired my own private investigator to find David. Caroline felt her stomach clench. Why? Because I needed to know. Needed to know if he'd ever stopped. If there were other women out there who deserved to know the truth about him. If there was anything I could do to, I don't know, make amends for not stopping him when I had the chance. Did you find him? Rebecca nodded slowly. He's dead. David died 3 years ago, car accident in Phoenix. He was 51, still running the same schemes apparently, still hurting women right up until the end. The investigator found his obituary, talked to some of the women he'd been seeing at the time of his death. One of them had just loaned him $20,000 for a business opportunity. Caroline felt dizzy. Dead. David was dead. All these years, some part of her had been carrying him around. Not love, not anymore, but the weight of what he'd done. The space he'd taken up in her life and in her relationship with Rebecca. And now, he was just gone. Had been gone for years without her knowing. How do you feel about that? Caroline asked. Him being dead? Rebecca considered. Relief, mostly, that he can't hurt anyone else. And also, anger, that he got to die without ever facing real consequences. That he never had to answer for what he did to us, to all those other women. That he probably died thinking he'd gotten away with it. He did get away with it, Caroline said bitterly. He destroyed our relationship and moved on to destroy others, and then he died, and we're the ones left holding the pieces. But we're here, Rebecca pointed out. We're here together, holding these pieces. And maybe we can put some of them back together. Not all of them. Some things are too broken to fix completely, but some of them, enough of them. Enough to be sisters again. They agreed to watch Aunt Dorothy's videos separately, in private, before meeting at the lake house. Caroline drove back to Boston in a daze, her mind struggling to process everything she'd learned. That night, alone in her apartment with a glass of wine she barely touched, she opened the video file Martin had emailed her. Aunt Dorothy appeared on screen, clearly filmed in her final weeks. She was in bed, thin and pale, oxygen tubes in her nose. But her eyes were bright, and when she smiled, Caroline could see the woman who'd spent summers teaching her and Rebecca how to fish and kayak and not be afraid of the dark. "Hello, my darling Caroline," Aunt Dorothy said, her voice weak but steady. "If you're watching this, it means you didn't walk out of Martin's office. It means you heard the truth about David, about what I knew and when I knew it. And it means you're probably very angry with me right now, and you have every right to be." Caroline wasn't angry, or maybe she was, but it was buried under so many other emotions that she couldn't access it clearly. She just watched her aunt's face on the screen and tried not to cry. "I want to tell you something about the lake house, something I never told anyone, not even your father. When I bought that house 40 years ago, I'd just gone through my own terrible heartbreak. I'd been engaged to a man named Peter, and 2 weeks before our wedding, I found out he'd been cheating on me with my best friend, my maid of honor, actually. The betrayal was devastating. I called off the wedding, cut off the friend, and ran away to that lake house to figure out how to put myself back together." Caroline leaned forward, riveted. She'd never known this story. Aunt Dorothy had never married, but Caroline had always assumed it was by choice, that she was one of those women who preferred independence. "I spent that whole summer alone at the lake, and I made a choice. I chose bitterness. I chose to believe that all people were fundamentally selfish and cruel. I chose to protect myself by never getting close to anyone again. And you know what? It worked. I never got hurt like that again. But I also never let anyone love me. I never had children. Never built the kind of intimate friendships that sustain you when you're old. I was safe, but I was also alone. And Caroline, that's not a life. That's just existence." Aunt Dorothy leaned closer to the camera, her expression intense. "I see you making the same choice I made. Building walls. Keeping people at arm's length. Your marriage failed partly because you never let your husband fully in, never trusted him completely. You're doing the same thing with Alex. Yes, your father told me about him. You're waiting for him to betray you, so convinced that betrayal is inevitable that you're going to make it happen through sheer force of expectation." Caroline felt exposed, like her aunt could see through the screen into her actual life. She thought about Alex, kind, patient Alex, who'd been trying to get closer to her for 2 years and kept hitting walls he didn't understand. She'd been waiting for him to leave or cheat or do something that would prove her cynicism right. And in the meantime, she'd been punishing him for crimes he hadn't committed. But here's what I learned. Too late to really use it. Being hurt isn't the worst thing that can happen to you. Being alone is worse. Being so protected that you're isolated is worse. Missing out on love, real, messy, complicated love, because you're afraid of being fooled again, that's worse. Caroline, you lost 23 years with your sister because you chose pride and anger over vulnerability and forgiveness. Don't lose the rest of your life making the same choice. The video continued for another 10 minutes. Aunt Dorothy sharing memories of Caroline and Rebecca as children, telling stories Caroline had forgotten, reminding her of who they'd been before David Chen had entered their lives and detonated everything. By the end, Caroline was sobbing, grieving not just for her aunt but for all the time she'd wasted being angry when she could have been healing. The next few days were strange. Caroline and Rebecca texted, tentatively at first, then more frequently. Just small things. Rebecca sent a photo of her cat. Caroline sent an article about something they'd both loved as kids. They were learning how to be in each other's lives again, taking baby steps across the chasm that had separated them for 2 decades. Saturday arrived cold and bright, the kind of November day that felt like a gift. Caroline drove to the lake house, arriving a few minutes before 10. Rebecca was already there, sitting on the porch steps, and Caroline's heart squeezed at how much this mirrored their childhood. Rebecca had always arrived early to everything, unable to wait patiently at home when something exciting was happening somewhere else. They went inside together, and the house was exactly as Caroline remembered it. Knotty pine walls, stone fireplace, the old couch that smelled faintly of mildew and lake water. Aunt Dorothy's presence was everywhere, in the photographs on the walls and the books on the shelves and the careful organization of the kitchen. "She left us this place so we'd have to come here," Rebecca said, standing in the middle of the living room. "So we'd have to be in this space where we were happy before." Smart, Caroline admitted. Manipulative, but smart. They spent the day going through the house, sorting through Aunt Dorothy's belongings, making piles of things to keep and donate and throw away. And as they worked, they talked, really talked, about their lives, their regrets, the people they'd become in the years apart. They pulled out old photo albums and laughed at pictures of themselves with terrible haircuts and worse fashion choices. They found letters they'd written to Aunt Dorothy from college, full of dreams and hopes and the innocent assumption that the future would be kind. Around 4 in the afternoon, while they were sorting through a closet, Rebecca pulled out a box. "Look at this." Inside were more photos, but these were recent. Pictures of Caroline and Rebecca that Aunt Dorothy must have gotten from their father. Caroline at her wedding, Rebecca at the opening of her non-profit, Emma and Lucas at various ages, Rebecca's house with its garden, 2 separate lives documented by someone who'd loved them both and mourned the fact that they couldn't be in the same frame. At the bottom of the box was one more thing, a photograph, clearly taken by Aunt Dorothy herself. It showed the porch of this very house, empty except for 2 rocking chairs side by side. Taped to the back of the photo was a note in Aunt Dorothy's handwriting. "These chairs miss having sisters in them." Caroline started laughing and crying at the same time. She was relentless. "She loved us," Rebecca said, "and she knew we loved each other, even when we were too stubborn to admit it." They decided to stay the night. Neither of them had made other plans, and the house had 2 bedrooms made up with fresh sheets, as if Aunt Dorothy had known they'd both come. They cooked dinner together, fumbling through the unfamiliar kitchen, arguing good-naturedly about how to season the pasta. It felt like muscle memory, like their bodies remembered how to be sisters, even if their minds were still catching up. After dinner, they sat on the porch in those 2 rocking chairs, wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching the lake turn silver in the moonlight. And Caroline finally asked the question she'd been holding back for days. "Do you think we can really do this? Get past everything? Or are we just pretending because Aunt Dorothy guilted us into it?" Rebecca was quiet for a long time. "I think," she said finally, "that we can't get back what we lost. Those 23 years are gone. But maybe that's okay. Maybe trying to recreate what we had before isn't the point. Maybe the point is to build something new, a relationship between who we are now, not who we were then." "I'd like that," Caroline said, "building something new." "Me too." Rebecca reached over and took Caroline's hand. "I have to tell you something else. Something the investigator found that I haven't told anyone." Caroline's stomach clenched. "What?" "David had a daughter. From one of the other women he scammed. She'd be about 20 now. The investigator found her on social media. She doesn't know anything about her father. The mother told her he died when she was a baby. which is probably kinder than the truth. Caroline absorbed this. Somewhere out there was a young woman who was half David Chen, who'd inherited his DNA, if not his cruelty. Why are you telling me this? Because I've been thinking about reaching out to her. Not to tell her about David, she doesn't need that burden, but maybe just to, I don't know, let her know there are people out there who understand complicated family histories, who know what it's like to be shaped by someone's absence. Rebecca paused. But I wanted to ask you first. If you think it's a terrible idea, I won't do it. Caroline thought about her own children, about how they'd grown up without really knowing their aunt, about patterns that repeated across generations if you didn't actively work to break them. I think, she said slowly, that if you do reach out to her, I'd like to be part of it. If that's okay. If she wants to know about David's past, she should hear it from both of us. The full story. Not the version where we're victims, but the version where we're survivors who found our way back to each other. Rebecca squeezed her hand. I'd like that. They decided to keep the lake house. Not as an investment or a vacation rental, but as a place where they'd meet regularly, rebuilding their relationship in the space where it had once been strongest. The first few months were awkward. They had to learn each other's rhythms again, figure out how to navigate disagreements, create new traditions to replace the old ones that had died in the gap between them. But slowly, it worked. They met at the lake house once a month. Sometimes they brought work and sat in comfortable silence, each doing their own thing. Sometimes they talked for hours, filling in the details of 2 decades apart. Sometimes they just existed together, proving to themselves that they could occupy the same space without the past crushing them. Caroline brought her children. Emma came first, nervous and uncertain about meeting an aunt she'd never known. But Rebecca won her over with embarrassing stories about Caroline as a teenager, and by the end of the weekend, Emma was calling Rebecca regularly to talk about college and boys and all the things she couldn't quite discuss with her mother. Lucas was harder, 15 and sullen and suspicious of this aunt who'd appeared out of nowhere. But Rebecca didn't push. She just showed up consistently, month after month, until Lucas stopped treating her like a stranger and started treating her like family. One night, Caroline walked into the kitchen and found Lucas showing Rebecca a video game he loved, animated in a way he never was with Caroline. She'd felt a moment of jealousy before it transformed into something else, gratitude. Her son had more family now, more people to love him. That was a gift, not a loss. 6 months after the lawyer's office, Caroline invited Rebecca to Thanksgiving. It was the first time they'd celebrated a holiday together since that disastrous anniversary party 23 years earlier. Caroline's ex-husband came with Lucas, and he and Rebecca got along surprisingly well, bonding over their shared experience of loving Caroline despite her emotional walls. Alex was there too, and Caroline introduced him properly this time, not as someone I'm seeing, but as my boyfriend. Rebecca raised an eyebrow at the term but didn't comment, just hugged Alex and thanked him for taking care of her sister. That night, after everyone had left, Alex asked Caroline if she wanted him to stay over instead of going back to his own apartment. And for the first time in 2 years of dating, Caroline said yes. They made love slowly, carefully, and afterward Caroline cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming emotion of finally letting someone in, finally trusting someone enough to be vulnerable. Alex held her and asked if she was okay, and Caroline said, I think I'm healing. I think I'm finally healing. A year after Aunt Dorothy's letter, Caroline and Rebecca reached out to David's daughter. Her name was Michelle, and she was studying psychology at college. They sent her a careful message explaining who they were, what they knew, offering to share information if she wanted it, but respecting her choice if she didn't. Michelle responded 3 days later. She'd always known something was off about her father's story, always felt like there were pieces missing. She wanted to know everything. So Caroline and Rebecca met with her at a coffee shop in New York, neutral territory, and spent 4 hours telling her the truth about David Chen, about his schemes, his manipulation, the trail of broken relationships he'd left behind. Michelle cried through most of it, but at the end, she thanked them. I always thought maybe it was my fault somehow, that he died because of me, or that I was the reason my mom struggled so much. But this, knowing he was like this with everyone, it means it wasn't about me at all. No, Rebecca said firmly, it was never about you. You're not responsible for his choices or his cruelty. You're just a person who happened to share his DNA, and that doesn't define you. They stayed in touch with Michelle after that. Not frequently, she had her own life to live, but regularly enough that she knew she had family if she needed them. Caroline and Rebecca became aunt figures to her, offering advice when she asked for it, support when she needed it, and the truth about difficult family histories when she was ready to hear it. 2 years after the letter, Rebecca met someone. His name was Thomas, and he was a therapist who specialized in trauma. He understood Rebecca's hesitation about relationships, didn't push when she needed space, and loved her patiently through all her complicated feelings about trust and vulnerability. Caroline was at their wedding, served as Rebecca's maid of honor, actually, the role she'd been meant to play 25 years earlier before David had detonated everything. Standing at the altar watching her sister get married, Caroline thought about Aunt Dorothy, about the choice her aunt had made to protect herself by never loving again, and how that choice had resulted in decades of loneliness. Caroline had been heading down the same path, and it was Aunt Dorothy's final intervention that had changed her trajectory. If this story has touched your heart, if you've ever lost someone important over a misunderstanding or needed the courage to reconcile, please leave a like, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me in the comments about your own journey toward forgiveness and healing. These stories remind us that it's never too late to choose love over pride. 3 years after the letter, Caroline and Alex got engaged. It was a small proposal, just the two of them at the lake house sitting in those rocking chairs on the porch. Emma and Lucas were thrilled. Rebecca cried happy tears and immediately started planning the wedding. They decided to get married at the lake house, the place where Caroline's family had been shattered and then slowly pieced back together. The wedding was perfect, small and intimate, just family and close friends. Caroline wore a simple dress and carried wildflowers from the lake house garden. Rebecca stood beside her as maid of honor, and when the officiant asked, "Who gives this woman to be married?" it was Lucas who spoke up. Her family, all of us, together. During the reception, Caroline pulled Rebecca aside. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not giving up on me, for not staying angry, for being brave enough to sit in that lawyer's office and hear the truth even when it hurt." Rebecca hugged her tightly. "We saved each other. That's what sisters do." That night, after all the guests had left, Caroline and Alex and Rebecca and Thomas sat on the porch together, watching fireflies dance over the lake. And Caroline thought about the letter that had changed everything. Aunt Dorothy's final gift, delivered from beyond the grave, forcing 2 estranged sisters to confront the truth they'd been running from for 23 years. Some wounds were too deep to heal completely. Some scars would always remain, but that didn't mean healing was impossible. It just meant healing looked different than she'd expected, not erasing the past, but learning to carry it differently, transforming pain into wisdom, isolation into connection, anger into forgiveness. Caroline still wore her old wedding ring sometimes, that symbol of a failed marriage and broken trust, but now she wore it on a different finger as a reminder of who she'd been and how far she'd come. She'd started a new tradition too. Every year on the anniversary of that meeting in the lawyer's office, she and Rebecca would return to the lake house alone. They'd sit in those rocking chairs and read Aunt Dorothy's letter out loud, remembering what they'd almost lost and celebrating what they'd found. On one of those anniversary visits, 5 years after the letter, Rebecca said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Aunt Dorothy had told us the truth right away? If she'd called us that week after the party and explained about David?" Caroline considered. "We probably wouldn't have believed her. We were both so convinced we were right, so angry at each other. We needed the distance, needed to grow up, needed to become people who were capable of hearing difficult truths." "So you think the 23 years were necessary?" "No," Caroline said firmly. "They were tragic and wasteful and we'll never get them back. But maybe they taught us something that a quicker reconciliation wouldn't have. They taught us that pride isn't worth losing people you love, that assumptions can destroy what should be unbreakable, that truth matters more than being right." They rocked in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the lake, painting the water in shades of gold and rose. Somewhere in the house, Aunt Dorothy's presence lingered. In the photographs on the walls, in the furniture she'd chosen, in the very existence of this space she'd preserved for them. A place where 2 sisters could find their way back to each other. "I miss her," Rebecca said quietly. "I'm angry at her for not telling us sooner, but I also miss her terribly." "Me too," Caroline agreed. But you know what? I think she'd be happy. Seeing us here together, seeing that her letter worked, that we chose to believe the truth instead of the lie. I think you're right. Rebecca reached over and took Caroline's hand. Thank you for choosing me, for choosing us. Always, Caroline said. From now on, always. And as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the lake settled into twilight, two sisters sat together in the quiet, no longer separated by anger or pride or the manipulations of a man who'd been dead for years. They'd walked through fire to get here, had lost decades they could never reclaim. But they'd found each other again, and that was worth everything. The letter had given them truth. The lake house had given them space. Time had given them perspective. But what brought them back together, what truly healed the breach, was something simpler and more profound. The choice to love each other despite the pain, to forgive each other despite the years, to be sisters not because it was easy, but because it was essential. Some inheritances are houses and money. Some are letters that arrive too late or just in time, depending on how you look at it. And some are the relationships we thought we'd lost forever, but find we can rebuild, brick by careful brick, until we've created something new from what was broken, something stronger for having been broken and repaired, something worth the long journey back to each other. That was Aunt Dorothy's real gift, not the lake house or the letter or even the truth about David. Her gift was the reminder that family isn't about perfection. It's about showing up. It's about choosing each other again and again, even after everything has fallen apart. Especially then, most of all then,